Money has a way of revealing who people really are. I learned this the hard way when my husband Mark slapped a red envelope on our kitchen counter and told me to withdraw $1,000 by tomorrow morning. "It's for the company gala," he said, adjusting his silk tie with manicured fingers. "I need you looking the part. I'm Jenna, and until that moment, I thought I knew what kind of marriage I had. 15 years of compromise and sacrifice had taught me to read between the lines, but this was different. This wasn't about appearance, it was about control. Mark, that's almost everything in our joint account." My hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white against the granite. "What about the mortgage payment?" He laughed, that hollow sound I'd grown to dread. "Always so dramatic, Jen. You think I haven't planned for that?" His phone buzzed and his eyes flickered to the screen. A slight smile crossed his face before he quickly turned it face down. "I can wear the black dress from last year's event. No one will notice. Everyone notices everything." He stepped closer, cologne overwhelming the lingering scent of my morning coffee. "Lucas just made me lead agent on the Riverside development. Do you have any idea what that means for us?" Us. The word hung between us like a bad joke. "I need you to be perfect tomorrow night. Perfect dress, perfect smile, perfect wife." His fingers traced my jawline, a gesture that once made me weak in the knees, but now sent ice through my veins. "Can you do that for me?" I nodded, because that's what I always did. 15 years of nodding had become a habit harder to break than any addiction. "Good girl." He grabbed his briefcase, already moving toward the door. "Oh, and make sure you get your hair done. Emma recommended that new place downtown, Lux, I think. Put it on the credit card." Emma. His assistant's name dropped like poison in my coffee. 28, ambitious, and everything I used to be before I became Mark Thompson's wife. The door closed behind him, and I stood alone in our designer kitchen, staring at that red envelope. Inside was a withdrawal slip, already filled out in his precise handwriting. All it needed was my signature. I called Claire, my best friend since college, now a successful lawyer who'd been telling me for months what I refused to see. "He wants me to empty our account," I said when she answered. "For a dress. Jesus, Jenna." Her voice carried the weight of unspoken warnings. "Tell him to go to hell." "It's not that simple." "It never is with Mark." Papers shuffled in the background. "Remember when he borrowed from your inheritance for that investment scheme? How did that work out?" The memory stung. $40,000 of my father's hard-earned money, gone in a flash of Mark's signature. "I can't just..." "Can't what? Stand up for yourself. He's bleeding you dry and you're letting him." My phone buzzed with a text. "Mark, Emma's booking your appointment at Lux for 2 p.m. Don't be late." Something snapped inside me, quiet but definitive, like a thread pulled too tight for too long. "Claire," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need your help with something. Name it. I need to know my options, all of them, and I need to know how to make sure I don't lose everything when I use them." The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats. "Come to my office. Now." Her tone had shifted from friend to lawyer. "Bring any financial documents you can get your hands on." I looked at the red envelope again, at Mark's perfect handwriting, demanding my compliance. Then I opened our home office drawer and reached for the stack of bank statements I'd been pretending not to see for months. It was time to stop nodding. Claire's office felt like a confessional, all mahogany and leather, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across her desk. I spread out 15 years of bank statements between us, like tarot cards telling a future I should have seen coming. "Look at these transfers," Claire said, tapping her pen against a highlighted column. 5,000 here, 8,000 there, all to an account labeled Investment Holdings. Mark said it was for property developments. The words tasted stale, excuses I'd swallowed for too long. "And this one?" She pointed to a recent transaction. 15,000 to marketing consultancy services. My stomach clenched. That was supposed to be for the Riverside project's promotional campaign. Claire's expression hardened. "Jenna, I ran a check. That company doesn't exist." The pen between my fingers snapped, blue ink staining my skin like a bruise. What? It's a shell account. Opened 6 months ago. She slid a printout across the desk. The signatory is Emma Brooks. The room tilted sideways. I remembered Emma at last year's Christmas party, her hand lingering too long on Mark's arm, the way they both laughed at some private joke. I'd dismissed it then, told myself I was being paranoid. There's more, Claire continued, her voice gentle but firm. The withdrawal started around the same time Emma became his assistant. My phone buzzed. Another text from Mark. Appointment confirmed at Lux. Don't forget to pick up my dry cleaning after. I can't believe I've been so blind. I pressed my palms against my eyes until stars appeared. You weren't blind, Jenna. You were trusting. There's a difference. Claire leaned forward. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before I could answer, her office door opened. A familiar figure filled the doorway, and my heart stopped. Dad, Henry Collins, stepped into the room, his weathered face creased with concern. Claire called me. I hope you don't mind, Claire said. We need someone else in your corner. Dad sat beside me, his presence solid and reassuring, like it had been since I was little. Show me, he said simply. As Claire explained the financial maze Mark had created, I watched my father's expression darken. He'd never fully trusted Mark, especially after the inheritance incident. Now I understood why. Remember what you told me when you started teaching? I asked him suddenly. He raised an eyebrow. You said sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. I gathered the bank statements, arranging them chronologically. Well, I've made a hell of a mistake, and I'm ready to learn from it. What's your plan? Claire asked. First, I'm going to that hair appointment. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. Then I'm going to be the perfect wife at tomorrow's gala, just like Mark wants. Jenna, Dad started, but I cut him off. Because while I'm being perfect, I'm going to start documenting everything. Every transaction, every lie, every time he's been with Emma instead of at a client meeting. My voice was steady now, fueled by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. And when I have enough evidence, I'm going to take him apart piece by piece, just like he did to our marriage. Claire exchanged glances with my father. That could take time. Good. I picked up my purse, feeling the weight of the red envelope inside. Time is exactly what I need. Mark thinks he's the only one who can play the long game. He's wrong. Dad stood, pulling me into a hug that smelled of his old leather jacket and pipe tobacco. You're not alone in this, sweetheart. I know. I stepped back, wiping my eyes. But I need to do this my way. Mark's careful, methodical. To beat him, I need to be better. And the gala tomorrow? Claire asked. I smiled, thinking of the designer boutique downtown where Emma always shopped. I think it's time I met Mark's new assistant properly, don't you? After all, we seem to have so much in common. As I left Claire's office, my phone buzzed one final time. Mark again. Don't forget, perfect wife tomorrow night. I typed back, don't worry, honey. I'll be everything you deserve. The gala sparkled with fake smiles and designer dresses, a perfect stage for perfect lies. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching Mark work the crowd. He was in his element, one hand gesturing with practiced enthusiasm as he described the Riverside development to Lucas Reed. The other hand rested on Emma's lower back. Mrs. Thompson? A waiter appeared with champagne. Your husband asked me to bring you this. I accepted the glass, noting how Emma's eyes followed the waiter's movement. She whispered something to Mark, who nodded without looking at me. Their synchronized indifference made my skin crawl. My new dress, bought with that $1,000, felt like armor. I'd chosen emerald green, Emma's signature color, watching her face tighten when I'd walked in. Small victories. Jenna? Lucas broke away from the group, approaching with his characteristic warmth. The Riverside presentation was brilliant. Mark tells me you helped with the financial planning. Behind him, Mark's smile flickered. We both knew I hadn't seen a single document related to Riverside. Actually, I said, matching Mark's practiced tone. Emma handled all that. Didn't you, Emma? She startled, wine sloshing in her glass. I just assisted with the basics. Don't be modest. I stepped closer, noting how Mark's jaw clenched. Those marketing consultancy fees must have required quite a bit of coordination. Emma's face drained of colour. Lucas looked between us, confusion creasing his brow. Marketing fees? He asked. Darling, Mark cut in, his fingers digging into my arm. You must be thinking of something else. Let's get some air. I pulled away, the champagne in my glass trembling. No, I'm quite certain. $15,000 last month alone. Quite an investment in promotional materials. The room seemed to still. Lucas turned to Mark, his expression hardening. We haven't authorized any marketing expenditure for Riverside yet. It's a misunderstanding, Mark said smoothly, but sweat beaded at his temples. Jenna's been under a lot of stress lately. Have I? I pulled out my phone, fingers hovering over the banking app. Should we review the transactions together? Emma suddenly excused herself, practically running toward the ladies' room. Mark's perfect mask cracked just enough for me to see the panic underneath. Lucas, he said, let me explain. In my office, Monday morning. Lucas's tone left no room for argument. He nodded to me, something like respect in his eyes, before walking away. Mark grabbed my arm again, harder this time, steering me toward a quiet corner. What the hell do you think you're doing? Playing the perfect wife, I said, removing his fingers one by one from my arm. Isn't that what you wanted? You have no idea what you've just done. His voice shook with barely contained rage. That money was what, Mark? Payment for services rendered. I watched Emma return, makeup freshly applied over tears. Does she know about the Shell account? Or did you tell her those transfers were legitimate too? The colour drained from his face. How did you... Find out. Maybe I learned from the best. I finished my champagne, setting the glass on a passing tray. You taught me so much about appearances after all. I'll destroy you, he hissed, all pretense gone. Everything we have is in my name. You'll have nothing. I laughed, the sound sharp enough to make nearby guests turn. No, Mark, you already took everything. Now I'm taking it back. His phone buzzed. Emma, standing across the room, looking lost. Mark glanced at the screen, then at me, realization dawning in his eyes. You planned this, he said. The dress, the timing, all of it. Consider it my contribution to the Riverside project. I straightened his tie, just as he'd done yesterday morning. I'm sure Lucas will have questions about those marketing fees on Monday. Better get your story straight. I turned to leave, but he caught my wrist. This isn't over. You're right. I pulled free, feeling stronger with each step away from him. It's just beginning. As I walked through the ballroom, heads turned. They'd seen enough, heard enough. Tomorrow the whispers would start. By Monday, Mark's carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Did it work? I looked back at Mark, standing alone now, his perfect world fracturing around him. Emma had disappeared, probably realizing she'd backed the wrong horse. Better than we planned, I replied. He never saw it coming, just like I hadn't. All those years ago, when he'd first started taking everything from me, piece by piece. Mark didn't come home after the gala. 3 days of silence stretched between us like a minefield, broken only by the buzz of my phone as Claire's updates rolled in. The latest one made my coffee go cold. Emma cleaned out her desk this morning, security escort. I was organizing patient files at the nurse's station when a shadow fell across my desk. Lucas Reed stood there, looking as out of place in the hospital hallway as I had felt at his gala. Mrs. Thompson. His voice was low, careful. Do you have a moment? We found an empty consultation room. Lucas didn't sit, just stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. The audit team found irregularities going back 18 months, he said, not just in Riverside, every major project Mark touched. My hands twisted in my lap. I see. No, I don't think you do. He turned, fixing me with a steady gaze. There's nearly $500,000 unaccounted for. The board wants criminal charges. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, matching the pitch of my rising panic. This was bigger than I'd imagined, deeper than Emma, more dangerous than revenge. Mark called in sick today, Lucas continued. Would you happen to know where he is? I thought of our empty house, of Mark's missing passport. No. Interesting. Lucas placed a business card on the table between us. Because someone transferred everything from your joint accounts this morning. All of it. The room tilted sideways. I grabbed the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood under my fingers, trying to stay grounded. When? My voice sounded far away. 6 a.m., right after Emma booked 2 tickets to Belize. He paused. Non-refundable. A laugh bubbled up, bitter as burnt coffee. Of course, while I'd been planning my small revenge, Mark had been orchestrating his escape, with her. The police will want to talk to you, Lucas said gently. As his wife, they'll assume you knew. But I didn't. The words came out sharp, defensive. No? He raised an eyebrow. You seemed pretty well informed about those marketing fees at the gala. The trap snapped shut. In trying to expose Mark's affair, I'd implicated myself in his fraud. My fingerprints were all over those bank statements, my signature on joint accounts that had funded his schemes. My pager buzzed. Emergency in Ward 3. Real life calling through the chaos. I have to go. I stood, professional mask sliding back into place. My patients need me. They'll come for you first, Lucas said as I reached the door. When they can't find him, you'll be their easiest target. I thought of the red envelope, still sitting on my kitchen counter. The withdrawal slip with my signature, proof of my compliance. Every nod, every silence, every time I'd looked the other way, they all led to this moment. Then let them come. I straightened my scrubs. I've got nothing left to lose. Lucas's card burned in my pocket as I walked back to the nurse's station. 3 messages waited on my phone. Claire, call me, now. Dad, coming to get you. Pack a bag. And Mark, finally breaking his silence. You started this game, Jen. I'm just better at playing it. A young resident rushed past, clutching trauma reports. Another life hanging in the balance. Another crisis to manage. I'd spent 15 years helping people survive their worst days. Maybe it was time to survive my own. I dialed Claire's number, watching the hospital corridors fill with the usual controlled chaos of afternoon rounds. They froze all the accounts, she answered without greeting. But I found something. Remember that investment account from your inheritance? The one Mark lost? What about it? It never existed. He opened a separate account in your name, used your social security number. The money's still there, hidden under layers of shell companies. Hope flickered, dangerous as a match near gasoline. Can we prove it? Better. I could hear her smile through the phone. We can take it back, but we have to move fast. My pager buzzed again. Through the window, I saw my father's truck pull into the hospital parking lot. How fast? Now, Jenna, we move now. I looked down at my scrubs, at the hospital ID that declared me Jenna Thompson, RN. Mark's perfect wife, about to become his perfect scapegoat, not anymore. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, already walking toward the exit. And Claire, bring everything you have. It's time to start playing by my rules. The laptop screen cast a blue glow across Claire's desk as we traced Mark's digital footprints. Each new document felt like another nail in a coffin I'd helped build. Look at this, Claire said, turning the screen. He used your nursing license number to open credit lines in 3 different states. My father paced behind us, his reflection ghosting across the window. Identity theft, that's federal. It gets worse. Claire pulled up another file. Remember that patient who left you money in their will last year? My throat tightened. Mrs. Henderson? Mark intercepted the attorney's letters, forged your signature on the documents. She slid a paper across the desk. He redirected the inheritance to one of his shell companies. The room spun. Mrs. Henderson had been my patient for 2 years. a kind woman who'd lost her battle with cancer. She'd left me $50,000 as thanks for my care during her final months. I'd thought the attorney had made a mistake when nothing came through. That money was meant for nursing school, I whispered, for my master's degree. Dad's pacing stopped. The degree he said you couldn't afford. My phone buzzed. Emma's name flashed on the screen, the first contact since she'd disappeared with Mark. Put it on speaker, Claire said, already reaching for her recorder. I answered. Emma? He left me. Her voice cracked. At the airport, took everything and left me with security breathing down my neck. Claire's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word. Where are you? I asked. Some motel in Mexico. I've got nothing left, Jenna. He promised we'd start over together, but... She broke off, sobbing. The police think I knew about the fraud. They're calling it conspiracy. Dad and Claire exchanged looks. This could be a trap. Why are you calling me? Because I found something in his laptop before he took it. Files about you, about everyone he's stolen from. Names, accounts, everything. She paused. I'll trade you. The files for immunity. My laugh sounded hollow. I can't promise you immunity, Emma. I'm probably going to jail myself. No, you're not. Her voice hardened. These files prove he set you up years ago. Every transaction, every forgery. He planned it all. Made you look complicit while he built his escape route. The pieces clicked together. The red envelope, the joint accounts, the constant demands for signatures on documents I never got to read. Where can we meet? I asked. Jenna, Dad warned. But Claire held up a hand, mouthing, Wait. I'm coming back tomorrow, Emma said, meeting Lucas at noon. He promised to help if I cooperate. Claire scribbled on a notepad. Trap. Tomorrow then, I said, watching Claire nod. Just you and Lucas. And the FBI. Emma's voice cracked again. I'm sorry, Jenna, I really am. The line went dead. Claire was already dialing. Lucas, we need to talk. Now. My phone buzzed again. Mark. Did Emma call? Don't trust her. She'll say anything to save herself. Remember who knows you better, Jen. Who knows what you've done. He's playing us against each other, I said, showing them the message. Trying to make us destroy each other while he gets away. Then let's give him what he wants. Claire hung up her phone. Lucas is bringing the FBI to my office tonight. We're going to plan a little performance for tomorrow. What kind of performance? The kind where you and Emma tear each other apart publicly while we trace Mark's real location. She smiled grimly. He'll be watching somehow. Men like him always need to see the damage they've caused. Dad touched my shoulder. You don't have to do this, sweetheart. We can find another way. I thought of Mrs. Henderson, of the degree I never got to pursue, of all the dreams Mark had stolen while pretending to protect me from them. No, I said, picking up the red envelope from Claire's desk. This started with his performance. It's fitting it ends with mine. Claire nodded. The FBI will be here in an hour. Ready to become everything Mark thinks you are? I smoothed out the withdrawal slip inside the envelope, my signature stark against the paper. One last act of compliance that had started this whole unraveling. Ready to become everything he fears I can be. The FBI's surveillance van smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Agent Torres adjusted my wire while explaining the plan one last time, but my attention fixed on the cafe across the street where Emma sat waiting. Remember, Torres said, we need him to reveal his location. Keep her talking about Mexico. I nodded, watching Emma through the van's tinted windows. She looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes replaced by wrinkled travel wear, the perfect wife reduced to Mark's perfect victim. Just like me. He's watching, Claire said from her laptop. Mark just accessed the cafe's security feed, using Emma's old login. My hands trembled as I smoothed down my shirt. Good. The cafe door chimed as I entered. Emma's head snapped up, mascara smudged beneath red-rimmed eyes. The FBI had already swept her for weapons and wires. She was clean, desperate, perfect. You look terrible, I said, sliding into the booth. You would too if... She stopped, glancing around. Is anyone else coming? Just us. I placed the red envelope on the table. And whatever ghost of Mark is watching through those cameras. Her face paled. He's not. Save it. I pushed the envelope toward her. Show me the files. Emma's fingers twitched toward her bag. How do I know you won't just turn me in? Because I'm already ruined. I leaned forward, letting her see the rage I'd hidden for 15 years. He made sure of that the day I signed this withdrawal slip. She pulled out a thumb drive, then hesitated. He said you knew about everything. The fraud, the accounts, all of it. Said you were the mastermind. A laugh burst out, sharp as broken glass. And you believed him, the same man who promised to leave his wife, to start fresh with you in Mexico. He loved me. He loved what you could provide. I gestured to the thumb drive. Access, alibis, a fresh victim when I stopped being useful. The cafe door chimed again. Lucas walked in, right on schedule. FBI agents disguised as customers shifting slightly in their seats. Time's up, ladies. He approached our table, badge visible on his belt. Emma, the federal agents are ready for your statement. She clutched the thumb drive tighter. Wait, I need... My phone buzzed. Mark's message lit up the screen. You really think you can beat me at my own game, Jen? Check your email. I spread through my veins as I opened my inbox. There it was. Dozens of emails, spanning years, showing my apparent knowledge of every fraud, every scheme. All perfectly forged, all dated years back. He played us both, I whispered, showing Emma the screen. These emails, he must have been planning this for years. Her face crumpled. The thumb drive. It's not just about the fraud. There's more. What do you mean? Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only patient he stole from. She slid the drive across the table with trembling fingers. There were others, so many others. The cafe's security camera whirred, turning toward our table. Mark was watching, waiting for his masterpiece to unfold. Lucas reached for the drive, but I was faster. Plugging it into my phone, I opened the first file. Names, dates, account numbers, deaths, my patients, my vulnerable, trusting patients. All of them targeted, their final gifts and bequests redirected, their families left wondering why their loved ones' last wishes weren't honored. The room spun. Years of careful documentation spread before me, not just of fraud, but of calculated predation. Mark hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen dignity from the dying. My phone buzzed again. Now you know everything. Run if you want. The evidence points to you, the devoted nurse, taking advantage of her patient's trust. Who would believe otherwise? Emma started crying, quiet, broken sobs. Lucas's hand found my shoulder, steadying me as the full weight of Mark's betrayal crashed down. He's won, I whispered, staring at the evidence of years of calculated destruction. He's actually won. The cafe door chimed one final time. Agent Torres walked in, face grim. We lost his signal, she said. He's gone. In the security camera's dark eye, I watched my reflection. The perfect wife, the dedicated nurse, now the perfect scapegoat for a man who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. The red envelope sat between Emma and me, a reminder of where it all started. One small act of compliance that had opened the door to hell. Mark was free, and I was left holding evidence of crimes I never knew I was committing. The burner phone Claire gave me buzzed at midnight. One message. Transferring funds now. Belize National Bank. Mark's fatal flaw was always his pride. He couldn't resist one final victory lap. Got him, Agent Torres said, her team tracking the transfer in real time. He's at the Marina Hotel in Belize City. I stared at the phone, remembering every patient whose trust Mark had betrayed through me. How long until local authorities can... Wait. Claire's voice cut through the surveillance van. He's calling. My hands shook as I answered. Hello, Mark. I have to admit you surprised me. His voice carried that familiar smugness. Using Emma was clever, almost as clever as my contingency plans. You mean the forged emails? The fake paper trail? He laughed. Oh, sweetheart, those were just insurance. I'm talking about the second thumb drive, the one Emma doesn't know about. My blood ran cold. In the van, agents scrambled to track his location. What drive? The one I left with your father's lawyer yesterday, containing evidence of your involvement in a decade of patient exploitation. His voice hardened. Unless what? Unless you convince the FBI to back off. Tell them Emma acted alone. I'll destroy the evidence. You keep your nursing license, everyone wins. Claire was already shaking her head, mouthing stalling. We needed 3 more minutes to triangulate his position. You really think I care about my license now? No, he said softly. But you care about your father's reputation. My heart stopped. What? Did you really think I'd let Henry keep his pension after he helped you investigate me? One anonymous tip about a teacher who covered up student abuse 30 years ago. You're bluffing. But my voice cracked. Check tomorrow's paper. The story's already filed. Keys clicked in the background. You have 1 hour to call off the FBI. Otherwise what, Mark? The words burst out, years of rage behind them. You'll destroy another life? Add 1 more victim to your list? Silence stretched between us. In the van, Agent Torres held up 1 finger. 1 minute more. You know what your problem is, Jen? His voice turned contemplative. You never understood the game. While you were playing nurse, building your little house of cards with Claire and Daddy, I was playing chess. No. I gripped the phone tighter. My problem was believing you ever loved anything except power. Power? He laughed again. Power is watching you scramble to save your father's reputation. Power is knowing you'll fold, just like you always do. Because deep down, you're still that insecure nurse who needed me to make her decisions. 30 seconds, Torres whispered. I thought of the red envelope, of Mrs. Henderson, of every patient who trusted me, while Mark turned their faith into profit. You're right about one thing, I said. I did need you to make my decisions. Until I didn't. What does that mean? It means check your accounts, Mark, all of them, now. Keyboard clicks, then silence. When he spoke again, his voice shook. What did you do? I learned to play chess. I nodded to Claire, who pressed enter on her laptop. Every account you opened in my name, I just emptied them. All that stolen money, it's being returned to my patients' families. With interest. That's impossible. The passwords were all variations of my name. Because your fatal flaw, Mark. It wasn't pride. It was underestimating me. Got him, Torres shouted. Local police moving in. Through the phone, I heard pounding on his door. Mark's breathing turned ragged. You really think this changes anything? I still have the evidence. You mean this? Dad's voice came through on the conference line. Your little package arrived right on schedule. Currently sitting with the FBI's forensics team. Mark's composure finally cracked. How? Because you were right. I did learn from you. I took a deep breath. I learned to plan ahead, to keep evidence, to always have a contingency. The sound of splintering wood came through the line, followed by shouts in Spanish. Goodbye, Mark. I ended the call as chaos erupted on his end. In the sudden silence of the van, Claire reached for my hand. You okay? I looked at the red envelope, now filled with evidence of Mark's crimes instead of my compliance. No, I said honestly, but I will be. The courthouse steps felt colder than they should in spring. I watched Mark being led away in handcuffs, his designer suit wrinkled from weeks in custody. He didn't look back. 15 years, Claire said beside me, closing her briefcase, plus full restitution to the victims' families. The red envelope sat in my purse, now filled with the judge's final order instead of Mark's demands, a reminder of how everything had started and ended. Mrs. Thompson, I turned to find Mrs. Henderson's daughter, Sarah, clutching a familiar leather-bound notebook. Your mother's journal. She wrote about you, Sarah said, offering me the book. Every day during her treatment, she knew something was wrong with the inheritance, but she couldn't prove it. My hands trembled as I took the journal. I'm so sorry I didn't see. No. Sarah touched my arm. You gave her dignity in her final months. That's what mattered to her. As she walked away, Emma emerged from the courthouse, flanked by her lawyer. Her immunity deal had saved her from prison, but her testimony had sealed Mark's fate. Our eyes met briefly before she hurried past, another victim of Mark's games trying to rebuild. Dad waited by his truck, looking more relaxed than he had in months. The false allegations against him had crumbled under scrutiny, just another of Mark's desperate plays. Ready to go home? He asked. Home. Not the designer house Mark had insisted we needed, but my childhood bedroom, temporarily reclaimed while I figured out what came next. Almost. I turned to Claire. There's something I need to do first. The hospital corridor felt different now. My colleague smiled, no longer whispering about the nurse whose husband had stolen from dying patients. I stopped at the oncology ward's nurse station, where a stack of applications waited. Graduate school? Claire asked, reading over my shoulder. Mrs. Henderson's original inheritance amount. I signed the application. Exactly enough for a nurse practitioner program. Fitting, she said, using his restitution money to become what he tried to prevent. My pager buzzed. A patient needed help. Some things hadn't changed. Go, Claire said. I'll file these. In room 415, an elderly man struggled with his water glass. I helped him drink, adjusted his pillows, performed the small acts of dignity that Mark had never understood. You're good at this, the patient said. Must be rewarding, helping people. I thought of Mrs. Henderson's journal, of all the patients who'd trusted me while Mark exploited that trust, of how revenge had felt hollow compared to this moment of simple human connection. It is, I said, more than I remembered. My phone buzzed with a text from the FBI. Mark's overseas accounts had been found. More victims, more restitution due. The work wasn't over. But as I walked back to the nurse's station, I passed the wall of thank you cards from recovered patients. Among them hung a new one from Sarah Henderson. Thank you for fighting for her dignity. Claire waited with the completed applications and a small smile. Ready? I touched Mrs. Henderson's journal in my pocket, thinking of all the stories it contained, of how revenge had started this journey, but something else had finished it. Almost, I said, reaching for my badge. The name Thompson stared back at me, another choice Mark had made for me. I pulled out a form I'd been carrying for weeks. One last thing to reclaim. Claire's smile widened as I signed my maiden name, Jenna Collins, watching the ink dry on the page. Now I'm ready. The red envelope still sat in my purse, a reminder of how easy it is to lose yourself in small compromises. But as we walked out of the hospital, I felt its weight differently. Not as a burden of what I'd lost, but as a lesson in what I'd found. Some people might call it justice, or karma, or revenge. But standing there, holding my graduate school application and Mrs. Henderson's journal, I finally understood what it really was. Freedom, not from Mark or his schemes, or even the pain he'd caused, but from the person I'd become while trying to be his perfect wife. And that was worth more than any revenge.
My name is Anna, and for the longest time, my life was all about chemistry and work. After high school, I threw myself into university, studying to become a chemical engineer. Then it was straight to the lab, developing new polymer compounds. My personal life? Didn't even make the to-do list. It was work, more work, and, well, you get it. Then, one unexpected night, everything shifted. I didn't even want to go to that party. It was one of those you have to come, Anna, situations where my friend Jenna practically dragged me out the door. It'll be fun, she said. I doubted that, but I went. At the party, Jenna was in her element, chatting up everyone. Then she grabs this guy by the arm and pulls him over to where I was nursing my drink in silence. Anna, meet Tom, she said, a little too enthusiastically for my liking. Tom, this is the genius chemist friend I was telling you about. Tom looked a bit taken aback, his eyes wide as he took me in. Hi, he said, his voice uncertain. Jen has told me quite a lot about you. Good things, I hope, I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. Yeah, very impressive, he managed, though it sounded like he was talking about a scary movie, not a person. We somehow stumbled through the initial awkwardness and found a quiet corner. Turns out, Tom worked as a manager at a trading company and was a lot more down to earth than our rocky start suggested. He confessed later that night that he'd been intimidated at first, thinking I was too smart for someone like him. That made me laugh. It was refreshing, really. We started seeing each other, and a year flew by. I was surprised at how serious we'd gotten, considering how I used to dodge anything personal like a chemical spill. Then came the day I met his family. His mom was a sweetheart, welcoming me with open arms. But his sister, Laura? A different story. Right from the start, she looked at me like I was a problem she hadn't figured out how to solve yet. During dinner, I tried to make conversation, asking her about her interests. She just smirked and said, "So, you're the chemist? You cook up stuff in the lab, and now you're here to cook my brother's brain?" I was taken aback, but managed a weak smile. I prefer to think I enlighten minds rather than cook them. Ethan, trying to cut the tension, jumped in. Laura's always been protective of me, he explained. She's not easy to win over, but don't take it personally. As if on cue, Laura leaned over and whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "No one's good enough for my brother, remember that." Despite Laura's cold reception, Ethan and I got engaged and planned a modest wedding. On our wedding day, Laura's attitude was even more brazen. She rolled her eyes during our vows, snickered during the speeches, and complained loudly about the food and decorations. A couple of months had passed since Ethan and I said our vows. Just as we were settling into our new life, his mother, Mrs. Johnson, took a bad turn. Her illness baffled the doctors, no one could pinpoint what was wrong. She was confined to her bed, her body partially paralyzed, plagued by severe headaches and kidney pain. Ethan suggested that I move into their family home to help care for her, and given my fond relationship with his mother, I agreed without hesitation. From day one, the reality of our situation hit hard. Mrs. Johnson was in a bad way, rarely leaving her bed, and I took on much of the caregiving alongside Ethan. I bathed her, helped her change, and gently combed her hair, which, distressingly, came out in clumps more often than not. One evening, while Ethan was downstairs sorting through some bills, I broached a delicate subject with him in the kitchen. "Ethan, your mom's condition is worsening. Don't you think a nursing home with professional care might be better for her?" I suggested, hoping he'd see the sense in it. Ethan rubbed his forehead, the weight of the world seeming to press down on him. "I know, Anna, I know it's bad. But Laura, she's adamant about keeping Mom here. She says a nursing home would just make things worse." I sighed, my hands clenching in frustration. "But isn't it worse for her to suffer here without proper medical care?" Before Ethan could reply, Laura walked into the kitchen. Her presence was always like a storm brewing. "I heard that, Anna. You think you know better than us? My mother stays where she is," she snapped, her eyes flashing angrily. Realizing this wasn't a battle I could win today, I backed down. "Okay, Laura. I didn't mean to upset you. I just hate seeing her like this." After Laura left, Ethan whispered a tired apology. "I'm sorry. Laura's been through a lot. You know, with her husband passing and everything. She's not herself." "Yeah, I get it," I replied, though I felt a bitter edge to my words. "But it's not just about what she wants. It's about what's right for your mom." Ethan nodded, looking equally torn. "I know. Let's just give it some more time. Maybe she'll come around." Time passed slowly after that conversation. Days turned into weeks. I spent hours by Mrs. Johnson's side, watching her struggle with every passing day. Her room became a world unto itself, filled with the sounds of her labored breathing and the soft hum of the medical equipment that seemed to multiply with each week. Laura's resistance, Ethan's indecision, and the daily sight of Mrs. Johnson's suffering weighed heavily on my heart. Moving in here, I had hoped to make things better, to be a part of the family in every way that counted. But as each day passed, I felt more like an outsider fighting an unwinnable battle, clinging to the hope that somehow, someway, I could make a difference in this house that had become my home. Living with Ethan's family was proving to be more of a challenge than I'd ever expected. My relationship with Laura was especially tense. She always found something to criticize about me, and it didn't help that Ethan rarely stood up for me in these conflicts. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen trying to prepare a meal that Mrs. Johnson could easily swallow. Ethan was at work, and I was alone, which was becoming more and more my preference given Laura's frequent, harsh visits. As I was mashing potatoes, the back door slammed. I didn't need to turn around to know Laura had entered. Making a mess as usual, I see, Laura's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. I kept my focus on the task at hand, my grip tightening on the masher. "I'm making dinner for your mom. She needs something easy to eat." Laura scoffed, leaning against the counter and watching me like a hawk. "You think you're some kind of saint, don't you? Always hovering, always playing the devoted daughter-in-law. Makes me sick." I placed the bowl down with a little more force than necessary. "I'm not trying to be a saint, Laura. I'm trying to help." "Oh, cut the crap, Anna. We both know you're just waiting for her to kick the bucket. Playing the grieving widow ahead of time, are we?" Laura snapped, her eyes gleaming with something spiteful. It was another regular Sunday dinner when the tension hit a new high. Laura had just breezed into the dining room, fashionably late as usual, wearing a bright red dress. As we sat down to eat, Laura started right in, like she was waiting just for that moment. "Really, Anna, must you always work so late? It's like you don't care about being a part of this family at all." I kept my eyes on my plate, trying to stay calm. "I do my best, Laura. My work demands a lot. Unlike you, who doesn't even know what it's like to work." Ethan, who had been silent up until then, finally spoke, though not in my defense. "Anna, please remember Laura is going through a lot right now with her husband's recent passing. Try to be a little more understanding." His words felt like a betrayal. I shot back before I could stop myself. Maybe if she dressed more like a widow rather than going to a party, I could take her grief a bit more seriously. The table went silent. Ethan's expression hardened. "Anna, that's uncalled for." "But it's true." I couldn't hold back. "She criticizes everything I do, but barely looks in on her own mother. How is that fair?" Laura slammed her fork down, standing abruptly. "How dare you judge my grieving process? You have no idea what I'm going through." Ethan rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. "Anna, can we talk about this later? Please, let's just finish dinner." I nodded, tight-lipped, and we ate the rest of the meal in uncomfortable silence. After dinner, I tried to clear the air with Ethan, but it was clear his patience was wearing thin. "Anna, I know it's hard, but you have to try harder with Laura. She's my sister. She's family." "And what am I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're my wife, and I love you, but Laura's been in my life a lot longer. You two need to sort this out." I felt alone, truly alone, even though Ethan was right there. It seemed like no matter what I did, it would never be enough for Laura, or, it seemed, for Ethan. 2 months had passed in a blur of daily routines and silent meals until the day we lost Mrs. Johnson. Her death was both a shock and a sorrow that gripped the household, pulling us all into a deep, somber state. Ethan was devastated, his grief palpable and heavy. At the funeral, under a dreary, cloud-filled sky, the tension that had been simmering between me and Laura finally boiled over. As people quietly murmured their condolences, Laura cornered me by the old oak near her mother's grave. "This is your fault, you know," Laura hissed, her eyes sharp and accusing. "If you had cared for her properly, she'd still be here." I felt a flash of anger, but I kept my voice steady. Laura, I did everything I could. She needed professional care, more than what we could give at home. Excuses, just excuses. Laura snapped back, her voice low but fierce. You just didn't want the burden, did you? I tried to keep calm, but her words stung. That's not true, and you know it. I cared for your mother every day. Laura scoffed, shaking her head before storming off. The days that followed were filled with quiet mourning. I tried to give Ethan the space to grieve, but the house felt colder, emptier. While tidying up Mrs. Johnson's room one afternoon, I stumbled upon some old medical documents tucked away in her desk. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to read through them. According to the files, Mrs. Johnson had been in excellent health just a year ago, but her condition had deteriorated rapidly, leading to the failure of several organs all at once. Later that evening, I brought it up with Ethan. It's odd, isn't it? Her health declined so suddenly. And it says here multiple organ failure was the cause. Ethan, still looking tired and worn from the days of grieving, nodded slowly. Yeah, it's strange. The same thing happened to Laura's husband. He also had multiple organ failures. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered something from my chemistry classes. Ethan, both your mom and Laura's husband had severe hair loss before they passed, right? He looked up, puzzled by the direction of my question. Yes, that's right. Why? I hesitated, the implications swirling in my head. It's just, severe hair loss can sometimes be a sign of thallium poisoning. It's a stretch, but... Ethan cut me off, his voice a mix of disbelief and irritation. Let's not go down that road. It's been tough enough without adding wild theories into the mix. I nodded, agreeing outwardly, while inwardly I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the coincidence gave me. But I knew better than to push it further. Ethan was already on edge, and my accusations, or even suspicions, could drive a wedge too deep to remove. It started like any other morning, except for the moment I ran my hands through my hair and felt a clump come away with my fingers. Staring at the strands in horror, my mind raced, I knew something was terribly wrong. Frantically, I headed to the lab at work, my heart pounding as I ran tests on myself, a procedure I was all too familiar with but never thought I'd use in such a personal emergency. The results were as chilling as my suspicions, traces of thallium in my bloodstream. Rushing home, I confronted Ethan, my voice trembling with fear and urgency. Ethan, I found thallium in my blood. Someone is trying to poison me. Ethan stared at me, his expression morphing from confusion to disbelief. You're being paranoid, Anna. You're seeing conspiracies where there aren't any. Before I could argue, Laura walked into the room, having overheard our conversation. Oh, please. You work in a lab, Anna. For all we know, you could have brought that poison home yourself. Maybe you poisoned Mom, she snapped, her voice dripping with accusation. I was aghast, the room spinning around me as her words sank in. Ethan's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. I can't do this anymore, Anna. You're too dangerous to be around. I want a divorce. My world crumbled in an instant. Laura smirked triumphantly. You heard him. Get out of our house. Numb and heartbroken, I packed my belongings, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. Sitting amidst the unpacked boxes, the truth slowly pieced itself together in my mind. It was Laura, she had poisoned her mother and tried to poison me. Determined to find proof, I hired a private detective and handed over all the evidence I had, including the medical reports and my blood test results. 2 weeks dragged by with agonizing slowness until the detective came back with shocking news. Laura had burned through the fortune she inherited from her late husband and was drowning in debt. It became clear her motives were as toxic as the poison she favored. This isn't just about inheritance, I told the detective, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. She's eliminating anyone who stands in her way. She could be targeting Ethan next. Armed with this new information, I knew I had to act fast to prevent further harm. I called Ethan, my voice trembling but firm. Ethan, I have proof about Laura. We need to meet. You have to see this. His response was cold, dismissive. "You're crazy, Anna. I can't believe I ever trusted you." And with that, he blocked my number, cutting off any chance of further communication. Standing there, phone in hand, I felt a mix of rage and resolve wash over me. Despite everything that had happened, I knew I needed to confront Ethan and reveal Laura's malicious plans. Reluctantly, he let me into the house. The coolness inside was a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside. Ethan was quiet, his face drawn and tired. There was a glass of lemonade on the table, condensation beating on the outside. "It's hot out there," he said, nodding towards the glass. "Here, have some lemonade." Thirsty and distracted by the tension, I took a few sips. Almost immediately, my stomach churned painfully, a sharp stab that doubled me over. "Ethan," I gasped, clutching my abdomen. "Where did this lemonade come from?" "It's just lemonade. Laura made it. What's wrong?" His brow furrowed, a mix of concern and confusion crossing his face. "The lemonade, it's poisoned," I managed to say between sharp breaths. "Laura's trying to kill us for the inheritance." Ethan's expression shifted from concern to disbelief. "You're out of your mind, Anna. I'm tired of these crazy theories about Laura trying to kill someone." I was desperate, the pain overwhelming. "Please, Ethan, you have to believe me. Call 911. As I spoke, my vision began to blur, and I felt myself slipping towards the floor. The cold tiles were a harsh welcome as I hit them, semi-conscious, barely aware of my surroundings. Just then, Laura walked in, catching the tail end of our conversation. She looked from Ethan to me, lying helpless on the floor, and a smirk twisted her lips. "Really, Ethan, she's losing it. Making up stories even now," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Ethan, conflicted and overwhelmed, rushed to the kitchen to fetch a cold compress, leaving me at Laura's mercy. Kneeling beside me, Laura leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "This is the end for you. In a few hours, the thallium will finish its work, and then Ethan's next. Once he's gone, everything will be mine." Her words were the last thing I heard before darkness enveloped me, pulling me into a deep, silent void. I awoke in the sterile brightness of a hospital room, the beeping of machines by my bedside punctuating the quiet. My mind felt foggy, memories of the last few days tangled like a ball of knotted yarn. The sharp pain in my stomach had subsided, replaced by a dull ache that seemed to echo deeper, reaching beyond the physical. The nurse, seeing me stir, came over with a reassuring smile. "You're in the hospital," she explained. "You've been out for days, but you're safe now." "Did anyone come with me? My husband, Ethan?" My voice was hoarse, the words scratching their way out. She checked her notes, her expression neutral. "No, you were brought in by an ambulance alone. But your husband did call 911, even though there was some resistance, apparently." A doctor came in next, flipping through my chart with clinical detachment. "You're lucky to be alive. We managed to remove the thallium from your system in time. A few more hours and—" He didn't finish his sentence, but he didn't need to. As the reality of the situation settled in, I felt a mixture of relief and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I was saved, yes, but at what cost? Ethan's absence spoke volumes, and the hurt from it gnawed at me. Later, 2 police officers walked into the room. Their faces were stern, their notebooks ready. "We understand you took matters into your own hands when you suspected poisoning. That was risky. You should have come to us as soon as you suspected something." Shame washed over me. He was right. I had been so caught up in proving Laura's guilt, I hadn't considered the dangers of facing her alone. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I needed proof. I thought I could handle it." The other officer softened slightly. "Well, your actions did lead to uncovering the truth. We've apprehended your sister-in-law. It turns out she did poison her husband and your mother-in-law with thallium. We exhumed their bodies and confirmed it. She's facing multiple charges now." Their words were a cold comfort. Justice might have been served, but the cost was etched deeply into my heart. The officers thanked me before leaving, their steps echoing down the hall long after they were out of sight. Recovery was slow, and with it came the realization that the next steps were mine alone to take. Ethan's absence had severed whatever ties remained, and as painful as it was clear that my path forward would not include him. The trial of my sister-in-law, Laura, dragged on for months. It was a grueling process, filled with legal complexities and emotional turmoil. Throughout it all, the courthouse was a cold place, echoing with the footsteps of those seeking justice and those dreading it. I hadn't seen Ethan since I left the hospital, not until the first day of the trial. He sat there, a stoic figure, clinging to a version of his sister that no longer existed in the eyes of the law. Despite the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, Ethan refused to believe Laura's guilt. He whispered fiercely during recess, "You're wrong about her. The tests, the accusations, they're all mistakes. Laura's an angel, not a monster." I looked into his eyes, searching for the man I once loved, but found only a stranger. "How can you still say that after everything? Look at the evidence." He shook his head, dismissive and cold. "It's all circumstantial. You just want revenge on her, that's all this is." The trial continued, witnesses came and went, experts testified about the lethal levels of thallium found in the bodies, and slowly, the truth began to unfold before everyone in that courtroom. Laura sat there, mostly impassive, until the pressure of the undeniable evidence reached a breaking point. On the final day, when confronted with a particularly damning piece of evidence, Laura's composure cracked. With a cruel smile, she confessed, her voice chilling the room. "Yes, I did it. I poisoned them all, my husband, my mother, and I tried to kill Anna and Ethan too. All for the property, all for a life I deserved." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the shock palpable in the air. Ethan's face drained of color as he turned to look at me, the realization of his sister's true nature finally dawning on him. Laura was found guilty of double premeditated murder and attempted murder. The judge handed down a life sentence, ensuring she would spend her remaining days behind bars. Additionally, all her assets were seized and awarded to me as compensation for the immense physical and emotional harm she had caused. After the verdict, Ethan approached me outside the courtroom. His eyes were red, his voice shaky. "Anna, I'm so sorry. I was blind. Please, can we start over? Can we try again?" The pain of his betrayal, once sharp and biting, had settled into a dull, constant ache. I looked at him, really looked at him, and knew that too much had passed between us, too much had been broken. "No, Ethan. I can't. It's over." He reached out, but I stepped back, my decision firm. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." Leaving the courthouse, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, not because I enjoyed the outcome, but because it was finally over. The battle was done, and justice, though it came at a steep price, was served. My recovery was slow, a process of rebuilding what Laura had tried to destroy. Physically, the poison had left its mark, and emotionally, the scars ran even deeper. I underwent treatment, attended therapy, and slowly pieced my life back together in a new apartment, far from the house that once promised a shared future with Ethan. Now, living alone, I work on forgetting, on healing. Some days are harder than others, the memories of betrayal and poison haunting me like ghosts of a past life. But each morning, I wake up and remind myself that I survived, that I am free from the web of deceit that once threatened to claim my life. Hey, I'm Ava. I run my own business making designer furniture. It's been a wild ride getting here by 33, but I wouldn't have it any other way. My life was mostly about work, though deep down, I hoped for more, like a family of my own. It was during one of my rare vacations down in Santa Cruz that everything changed. I was on the beach, trying to learn surfing, mostly failing and falling flat on my face into the waves. That's when Jake showed up with his surfboard under his arm, looking like he owned the place. "Need some help there?" he called out, jogging over. His voice was playful, a slight tease hanging in the air between us. I brushed the sand off my face, trying to look a bit less like a drowned rat. Do I look like I need help? He laughed, a deep, hearty sound that made me smile, despite my embarrassment. Well, you ain't exactly riding the waves like a pro. I shrugged and gave him a challenging look. Maybe I'm just enjoying my unique style of surfing. Ever thought of that? Unique's one word for it, he grinned, extending a hand to help me up. Name's Jake. I teach surfing around here. How about I give you a few pointers? No charge. I figured why not? It wasn't like I had anything better to do, and the guy seemed genuine enough. So, I took him up on his offer. Turned out, Jake was a natural teacher. He was patient, explaining things clearly without making me feel like an idiot. Balance is key, he instructed as he guided me on the board. You gotta feel the wave, be part of it, not fight it. Easier said than done, but with Jake's guidance, I actually managed to stand and ride my first wave. I couldn't believe it. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off again. That's it. You're a natural, Jake cheered, clapping his hands. I paddled back, flushed with excitement. Thanks, Jake. I guess you're a pretty good teacher. That night, we talked like old friends. Turns out, Jake moved around a lot as a kid, never really settling anywhere until he hit the surf towns. He loved the ocean, said it was the only place he felt at home. And what about you, Ava? What's your story? I told him about my business, how I'd started from scratch, working day and night to make it something real. He listened, really listened. And that's how it started, really. A simple meeting on the beach that turned into dinner, and a conversation that felt like it could go on forever. I didn't know then that I'd fall for him, hard and fast. But that comes later. For now, it was just two people, laughing over fish tacos, the ocean whispering in the background. I smiled. Maybe I've just found that someone. Life after meeting Jake took a fast track, like a runaway train I had no interest in stopping. Our courtship was a whirlwind, filled with laughter, beach days, and long, heartfelt conversations under the stars. It didn't take long before he popped the question. We were at our favorite spot on the beach, the same place where we first met. Hey Ava. Jake started, his voice unusually shaky. You and me, we're kinda great together, huh? I laughed, a little nervous, sensing something big was coming. Kinda great? That's the understatement of the year. He took a deep breath and went down on one knee, right there in the sand. Marry me, Ava. Let's not just be kinda great. Let's be amazing, together, forever. My heart skipped about a dozen beats. Yes, I blurted out, more tears in my eyes than I'd care to admit. Yes, I'll marry you, Jake. The wedding was everything I could have hoped for. It wasn't large, just close friends and family at a small chapel near the beach. The reception was at a local hall, decorated with simple flowers and strings of lights that made everything feel magical. But as we settled into married life, I started to see sides of Jake I hadn't known before. He loved the finer things, expensive clothes, high-end gadgets, and soon, a sleek sports car that ate up more money than I wanted to think about. One evening, as I was working through some designs, Jake strolled into my office, a glossy brochure in hand. Hey babe, check this out, he said, laying the brochure on my desk. I glanced at it, my stomach dropping as I saw the price tag on the car he was pointing at. Jake, this is really expensive. Are you sure we can manage this right now? He leaned back, a frown creasing his brow. Come on, Ava. You make good money, right? We can afford a little luxury. I sighed, knowing I'd regret it, but also not wanting to fight. Fine, but this is a big purchase. We should be careful with spending for a while. Trust me, babe, it's all under control, he assured me, but his casual dismissal of my concerns stung more than I expected. His parents, too, became a regular fixture in our lives. His mom, Marlene, and dad, Phil, were charming at first. They'd often come over, praising the house, the food, everything. But soon, every visit came with requests. "Ava, dear, you have such good taste. Could you help us pick out some new curtains? We just don't know what to get," Marlene would say, her eyes darting around our living room appreciatively. Sure, I helped. I even paid, thinking it was no big deal, a way to make them feel welcome. One night, after they'd left from one of their many visits, I collapsed onto the couch next to Jake, exhaustion nipping at my heels. "Your parents are really taking this family thing seriously, huh?" He chuckled, not catching my tone. "Yeah, they love you. You're like the daughter they never had." I bit my lip, not sure how to say what was on my mind without causing a rift. "It's just, they expect a lot. Gifts, money, time. It's getting to be a bit much, don't you think?" Jake's face hardened a little, his voice sharp. "They're just being friendly, Ava. They like spending time with us, that's all." I wanted to argue, to tell him it felt like more than that, like we were a bank they could take from without asking. But I held my tongue, the words happy wife, happy life echoing ironically in my head. Jake's attitude toward having kids started to put a real strain on us. I always knew I wanted to be a mom, but Jake's insistence on having a son was something else. It wasn't just a wish, it was an obsession. One night, after dinner, we sat down in the living room, each with a glass of wine, trying to unwind. That's when I decided to bring up the topic again. "So, Jake, do you really think it's that important to have a boy?" I asked, feeling my stomach knot up. Jake looked up then, his expression serious. "Of course, Ava. You know how important it is for me to have a son. Someone to carry on the family name, you know? But what if we have a daughter?" I pressed, needing him to see my point of view. He shrugged, a bit too casually. "We keep trying until we get a boy, I guess." The simplicity in his answer chilled me. "And what, the daughters we might have aren't good enough?" "Ava, come on, don't start that," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not about good enough. It's about having a son. My dad's the same way, you know that." The conversation hung heavily between us, unresolved. It was the same every time. Jake wanted a son so badly that it started to overshadow everything else in our relationship. When we learned that natural conception was off the table, IVF seemed like our only option. I threw myself into the process, researching clinics and treatments. The day we went to the clinic to start the treatment, the air between us was tense. In the waiting room, Jake fiddled with the pamphlets on the coffee table, his knee bouncing up and down nervously. "So, they can do that thing, right? Where they make sure we get a boy?" he whispered, leaning close. I frowned. "It's not that simple, Jake. And it's not exactly ethical to pick and choose like you're ordering a custom car." The strain only deepened once we were in the thick of IVF treatments. The hormones, the doctor's appointments, and the waiting were brutal. And through it all, Jake's impatience for a son grew into something ugly, a shadow over our marriage. When we finally got the news that we were expecting, I was over the moon. But Jake's first question cut through my happiness like a knife. "Did they say if it's a boy?" "It's too early to tell," I snapped, hurt by his one-track mind. And when the ultrasound revealed we were having twin girls, I saw the disappointment on his face. He tried to mask it, but it was too late, I'd seen it. That night, as we lay in bed facing away from each other, the distance between us felt wider than ever. When I gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Ellie, I was over the moon, but Jake, he couldn't hide his disappointment. He wanted a son so badly it clouded everything else. One evening, while the girls were cooing in their crib, Jake came into the nursery. The look on his face was serious, like he was about to say something important. "Ava, we need to try again for a son," he said bluntly, no preamble. I was taken aback. "Jake, look at what we've got. They're perfect. Why isn't this enough?" He paced a little, before stopping and turning to face me. "It's not about them not being enough. It's about continuing the family name, Ava. You know this." I sighed, feeling the weight of his expectations pressing down on me. We'll see, I replied, not committing but not dismissing him either. It was the easiest way to end the conversation without another argument. Not long after, life decided to test me again. Phil, Jake's dad, got seriously ill. One evening, Marlene, his mom, came over, wringing her hands with worry. Ava, the surgery Phil needs, it's urgent, and his insurance won't cover all of it. We need $50,000. The amount made me choke a little. That's a lot, Marlene. I know, dear, but we're desperate. We wouldn't ask if there was any other way. I thought about it, the businesswoman in me kicking in. I can lend you the money, but I'll need you to sign a receipt. It's just a safety measure. Marlene bristled a bit at that. Really, Ava, a receipt? We're family. I stood firm. It's nothing personal, Marlene. It's just how I handle things professionally. It's a lot of money. Reluctantly, she agreed, and the receipt was signed. Jake didn't take it well when he found out. You made my mom sign a receipt? What's wrong with you, Ava? It's how I protect our future, Jake. And it's for our girls. I shot back, frustrated at having to justify myself. Things settled down a bit until the girls were about 6 months old. That's when I found out I was pregnant again, naturally this time. I was shocked and happy but scared to tell Jake. His reaction was just as I feared. A son, Ava. It has to be a son. I don't need another girl, he said coldly when I told him. Months later, I gave birth to another beautiful girl. I named her Mia. Jake didn't come to the hospital, not even to see Mia or help me home. I ended up taking a taxi, 1,000 worries in my head. When I got home, the house was quiet except for the sound of the babysitter in the nursery. Jake wasn't there. He came back the next day, looking like he hadn't slept at home. Where were you? I asked, my voice tight with a mix of anger and despair. Out, was all he said, walking past me like I wasn't even there. He didn't even glance at Mia, his own daughter. The hurt from that cut deeper than anything else. Here I was, trying to keep our family together, and there he was, pulling further away every day. It was clear to me then that something had to change. Things had been rough since Mia was born, and they weren't getting any easier. Jake was hardly ever home, always at work, or so he said, and whenever he was around, he was distant, detached. Our financial arrangement had become a sore point. He stopped contributing to the household, saying, "You make enough for both of us, Ava. Handle it." Trying to discuss our issues felt like talking to a brick wall. He'd come home late, often just as I was putting the girls to bed, avoiding any real conversation. Even my in-laws added to the strain. Marlene would come over, not to see the girls, but to ask for favors or gifts. "Ava, dear, could you help me pick out a new microwave? You always choose the best appliances," she'd say, her compliments thinly veiling her true intentions. She barely glanced at her granddaughters playing on the floor beside her. Phil, after recovering from his surgery, didn't hold back his thoughts either. During one of his rare visits, he said bluntly, "We hoped for a grandson, Ava. These girls, they're fine, but a boy would have been better." But the real shock came when Jake stumbled in one night, looking more frazzled than usual. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "Ava, I screwed up. Big time," he blurted out, sinking onto the sofa with his head in his hands. "What happened? Talk to me, Jake." "I lost money, a lot of it. At the casino. I've got creditors on my back now. They're not the kind of people you can just brush off," he admitted, his voice laced with panic. Fear gripped my heart, not just for our financial security, but for his safety. "How much, Jake?" $25,000, he whispered. Despite everything, my instinct was to protect him, our family. "Okay, we'll handle this. But you have to promise me, no more gambling. Ever." "I swear, Ava. No more gambling. I can't lose you or the girls." So, I did what I thought was necessary. I transferred $25,000 to clear his debts. After that, Jake's demeanor changed overnight. He was home more, engaged with the girls, constantly showering me with affection and gratitude. "You saved me, Ava. I don't know how to thank you enough," he'd say, kissing me goodbye in the mornings. Things had been looking up for a while, with Jake seemingly back on track and us spending more time as a family. I actually started to believe that maybe we had turned a corner, that maybe everything would be alright. But that hope shattered the night Jake didn't come home. I stayed up all night, pacing the floor, trying his phone over and over, but it just rang out. No answer. My mind raced with all sorts of dreadful thoughts. Had something happened to him? Or was it something else? By the time he walked through the door early the next morning, my relief turned to anger the moment I saw him casually stroll in and head straight to bed without so much as an explanation. "Where have you been all night?" I demanded, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. He mumbled something incoherent and pulled the covers over his head. "Tired, talk later," he said, his voice muffled by the pillow. "No, we're talking now, Jake. You can't just disappear and not expect me to worry." But he was already snoring, completely oblivious to my panic or anger. That was the last straw. I decided then and there that I needed to know what was really going on. The next day, I hired a private detective. A week later, the detective came back with news that crushed whatever was left of my trust. Jake had a mistress, and she was pregnant. Pregnant with a son. The irony of it stung like salt in a wound. But what cut even deeper was learning that the $25,000 I gave Jake to cover his supposed debts hadn't gone to any creditors. Instead, he'd bought his mistress a new car, a thank you present for carrying his son. I was seething with rage when I called Marlene, my mother-in-law, hoping for some semblance of support. "Marlene, Jake has a mistress, and she's pregnant. And he bought her a car with the money that was supposed to pay off his debts," I said, my voice shaking with fury and disbelief. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Marlene's voice, cold and sharp, came through. "Well, maybe if you had given him a son, he wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you blaming me? For not having a son? That's why you think it's okay for your son to cheat?" "He needs an heir, Ava. It's important for men in our family to have a son," she insisted, as if that justified everything. "So my daughters mean nothing? Is that it?" I was nearly yelling now, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ava, you need to calm down and stop overreacting. It's not the end of the world. You just need to take better care of yourself, be more attractive, maybe then my son wouldn't need to go elsewhere." The call ended with her hanging up on me, leaving me stunned and furious. The betrayal from Jake was one thing, but the betrayal from someone I considered family was too much. It was clear to me now that Jake and his family would never change. They'd chosen their path, and I needed to choose mine. Revenge wasn't a path I ever thought I'd take, but at that moment, it felt like the only way to reclaim some semblance of dignity. My next calls were to my lawyer, Claire, known for her no-nonsense approach to family law. "Claire, I'm through being the understanding wife. It's time to push back, hard. I want full custody, and I want him to pay for what he's done," I told her, my voice steely. That evening, when Jake came home, I was ready for him. The moment he walked through the door, I could see the arrogance in his stance, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break. "Jake, we need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. He smirked, tossing his keys on the table. "What's up? Another lecture about how I should spend my time?" "No, not a lecture. I know about your mistress, and the child. I'm done. Here," I said, pushing the divorce papers across the table to him. "I've signed them. It's over." His smirk vanished, replaced by a frown. "You're serious? Look, I'm tired of this life too. Your constant nagging, the kids screaming. I was going to leave anyway." "Good. You should leave. But first, the car keys. You'll return the car and the $25,000 you spent on your girlfriend." "It wasn't your money to spend," I demanded, my tone unyielding. He scoffed. Come on, Ava, be reasonable. I need that money for my son. You can't do this to me. You can't just strip me of everything. That's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'm adding a lawsuit for the emotional distress you caused. You and your mistress will both pay, I declared, the finality in my voice echoing in the room. The legal battle that followed was intense. Jake tried to argue that he had no money, that I was being unreasonable and cruel. But the evidence was stacked against him, the transactions, the messages, his continual deceit. It was all laid bare for the court to see. The judge was stern as he handed down the verdict. Mr. Thompson, it seems you've not only breached the trust of your marriage, but also misused funds for personal gain at the expense of your family. You are hereby ordered to pay $20,000 in damages to Mrs. Thompson, another $20,000 from your mistress, and $400 per month per child in alimony. Jake's face during the ruling was a picture of shock and defeat. Forced to take out a loan, he had to scramble to cover the payments ordered by the court. The courtroom drama had barely settled when my in-laws decided to confront me. They stormed into my house like a hurricane, blaming me for everything under the sun. You've destroyed our family and ruined our son, Marlene shouted, waving her arms dramatically. Phil chimed in, his voice just as accusing. You took everything from him, made him out to be a monster. I listened quietly, letting them vent their anger and frustration. They hurled insult after insult, but I stood my ground, the calm in the storm. After they had exhausted their tirade, I calmly pulled out the receipt for the $50,000 I had loaned them for Phil's surgery. You owe me $50,000. I was generous then, but now I need that money back. Their anger turned to panic. We don't have that kind of money, Ava. We're old, we're not working, Marlene pleaded, tears starting to form in her eyes. That's not my problem. You signed an agreement. You owe me this money, I stated firmly, my resolve unshaken by their distress. Seeing that I wasn't backing down, Phil resignedly nodded. We'll find a way. We'll pay you back. True to their word, they took out a loan to pay me back and had to return to work to manage the payments. It was tough for them, but it was the consequence of their actions and decisions. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. I focused on raising my daughters and running my business. Despite the challenges, I never regretted standing up for myself. My girls were thriving, growing more beautiful and intelligent each day, and my business was doing well, giving us a comfortable life. Jake's fate turned out quite differently. Burdened by debt and unable to keep up with the financial demands of his actions, he was forced to work multiple jobs. He left his mistress after she gave birth to a daughter, not the son he so desperately wanted. The irony of it wasn't lost on me, but I felt no pleasure in his misfortunes. Months later, a knock came at my door. It was Marlene and Phil, looking older and more worn than I remembered. Ava, we've been thinking a lot about what happened. We're sorry, Marlene started, her voice trembling. Phil nodded, his eyes avoiding mine. We miss the girls. We were wondering if, maybe we could see them? I looked at them, seeing the genuine regret in their eyes, but the pain they had inflicted was too deep, and their betrayal too significant. I appreciate your apology, I began, my voice steady. But I can't let you back into our lives. Not after everything. The girls are doing well, and we're moving on. It's better this way. Marlene's eyes filled with tears, and Phil placed a hand on her shoulder. We understand. We wanted to try, Phil said, his voice thick with emotion. I wish you the best, but please respect our wishes and give us our space, I replied, closing the door gently but firmly. Turning back to my home, to the laughter of my daughters playing in the living room, I felt a profound sense of peace. We had come through so much, their little faces reminders of why every struggle was worth it. I had made tough decisions, but they were the right ones for us. So, there I was, standing outside the quaint little coffee shop where Clara had decided to play Cupid. Clara's been my go-to gal since high school, always into stars and numbers and all that jazz. Me? I've always kept my feet on the ground. But here I was, ready to meet Mr. Perfect Match according to her numerology charts. I spotted Clara waving frantically from inside. Pushing through the door, the bell jingled loudly, drawing a few glances. "There you are, Elle. I was starting to think you'd chickened out," Clara teased as I made my way over. "Chickened out? Me? Never," I scoffed, rolling my eyes but smiling. "But remind me again why I let you talk me into these things." Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Because deep down, you know I'm right. Plus, you've gotta admit, your dating pool has been more like a dating puddle lately." "Harsh, Clara. Really harsh," I said, but I couldn't help laughing. That was Clara for you, no filter, but usually right. Just then, a guy walked in, tall, dark hair, easy smile. The kind of smile that reached his eyes and made you want to smile back, even if you were trying to stay cool. "Ah, that's him," Clara whispered, giving me a nudge. "Mark, over here." Mark turned our way and walked over. He had a confident stride but not too cocky, which was good. We shook hands, and his grip was just right, not too firm, not too weak. "Nice to meet you, Elsie. Clara's told me a lot about you," he said, his voice warm. We ordered our coffees, and I went for my usual, black, no sugar. Mark went for the same, and Clara teased, "Look at you two, already a perfect match." As we settled into our seats, the initial awkwardness melted away surprisingly quickly. Mark was easy to talk to. He didn't just talk about himself either, he asked about my work as a video editor, genuinely interested in the details. "So, you edit videos? That sounds cool. Bet you've seen all sorts of crazy footage," Mark said, leaning forward, elbows on the table. "You have no idea," I laughed. "From wedding bloopers to failed YouTube stunts, I've seen it all." "What about you?" Clara mentioned something about engineering. "Yeah, I work with a small firm downtown. We handle all sorts of projects, from bridges to buildings. Keeps me on my toes," he explained. The conversation flowed from work to movies to our shared guilty pleasure of bad reality TV. It felt like talking to an old friend rather than a guy I just met. As the evening wound down, Mark said, "I had a great time tonight, Elsie. Maybe we can do this again? Just the two of us?" I hesitated for a split second, old habits die hard, but nodded. "I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, and as I walked home later, I couldn't help but think maybe Clara's numerology wasn't all nonsense. Mark really did seem like a great guy. But only time would tell. For now, I'd just enjoy the flutter in my stomach that I hadn't felt in a long time. When I moved in with Mark, everything felt like it was falling into place. He had this old house, a bit of a fixer-upper, but it had charm. We started talking about making it our forever home, and that's when the whole money talk came up. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, and we were lounging on the couch with cups of coffee, going over some bills and future plans. "Elle, you know how I've got that mortgage hanging over me, right?" Mark started, a bit hesitant. "I've been thinking, maybe we could use some of your savings to pay it off. It would be a load off, and we could start fresh, you know?" I took a sip of my coffee, buying some time. My savings weren't just rainy day money, it was the inheritance from my grandma, meant to be something special, something she saved for me. "Mark, that's a lot of cash. We talking about all of it?" I asked, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "Not all, no. Just the mortgage part. We'd still have plenty left for the house and maybe some extras," he said quickly, like he'd rehearsed it. I set my coffee down and turned to face him. "Look, I get where you're coming from, but that's big money. And it was meant for my future, you know?" Mark nodded, reaching for my hand. "I know, Elle, and this is our future, right? Together? Paying off that mortgage would mean less stress about finances. We could even start talking about renovations or a new car." I pulled back a little, thinking it over. It wasn't just money, It was security, my security, and Grandma's wish. But then, wasn't a happy, stress-free home with Mark worth it? Okay, suppose we do this, clear your mortgage. What's next? We're just going to jump into renovations? I asked, feeling the weight of the decision. Yeah, think about it. We could redo the kitchen, maybe knock out that wall to open up the living room. Make it really ours, he said, his eyes lighting up with every word. And furniture? We gonna spruce up that too? I was warming up to the idea, picturing the house transforming with us. Absolutely. New couch, dining set, maybe even that patio set you were eyeing last week, Mark replied, squeezing my hand. So, we did it. Paid off his mortgage and started planning the renovations. The next few months were a whirlwind of contractors and paint samples. The house was turning into what we'd imagined, and it felt good, mostly. There were moments, late at night, when I'd wonder if I'd put too much into this, too soon. But then I'd see Mark, all excited about picking out fixtures or tiles, and I'd tell myself it was right. The phone call that shook our newly renovated home came late one evening. Mark's phone lit up, buzzing insistently on the kitchen counter. The look on his face when he picked up told me it wasn't good news. Mom? Slow down, what's happened? Mark paced the length of our kitchen. I could only catch bits and pieces, but enough to piece together the emergency. His dad had a stroke. Okay, we're coming. Just hang tight. Mark ended the call and turned to me, his face pale. It's Dad, he's had a stroke. We need to go, Elle. Packing a bag in a whirl, we drove through the night to his parents' place in the next city over. We arrived to find Mark's mom, Linda, a small, wiry woman with more nerves than calm. She was fretting in the doorway as we pulled up. Mark, thank God you're here, she said, pulling him into a tight hug. Then her eyes landed on me. Elsie, you too. Inside, the house was dim, the air thick with tension. Linda led us straight to where Mark's dad, Joe, lay in bed, his left side immobile, his face drawn. Dad, it's me, Mark. We're here now, Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. Joe's right hand twitched, his eyes showing a flicker of recognition. Linda hovered by the bed, wringing her hands. He can't speak. The doctors, they don't know if he'll recover fully. What are we looking at here, Linda? Does he need rehab? A nurse? I asked, feeling out of my depth but needing to know the plan. Linda shook her head, a stubborn set to her mouth. No, he stays here. He wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But Linda, think about professional care. He needs specialists. I pushed gently, knowing she was scared but also aware of what was at stake. No, Elsie. We can't afford that, and this is his home. He stays, Linda snapped, her tone final. At a family dinner that night, the air was tense as Mark and Linda laid out their expectations. Mark took a deep breath. Elle, I have to head back for work, but Mom needs help here with Dad. You've seen how hard it is for her. Linda nodded, her gaze fixed on me. Yes, Elsie, please. I can't manage on my own with my sciatica acting up. It means so much to us. I felt the weight of their gaze, the desperation in Linda's voice. Mark was looking at me too, his eyes pleading. I knew what my answer would be before I even said it out loud. After Mark left, the reality set in. It was just me and Linda, and mostly just me, taking care of Joe. Linda's bouts of sciatica left her bedridden many days, and I was running the house, managing medications, and trying to keep up with my own work remotely. The days were turning into a blur of endless tasks and mounting frustrations. Linda, blaming everything on her own health issues, didn't lift a finger around the house. Worse, she had a knack for making me feel like nothing I did was ever enough. Elsie, are you going to sit at that computer all day? Linda's voice would slice through the quiet of the house like a knife. I was hunched over my laptop, trying to meet a video editing deadline, the stress evident in my tightly furrowed brow. I'm working, Linda. This is my job. I'd respond, my voice strained but calm, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. It doesn't look like much work to me, she'd scoff, shuffling off with an air of disapproval. I bit back the sharper retorts teetering on the tip of my tongue. After all, she was family, and family meant biting your tongue until it bled, right? But it was hard, especially when I felt more like a maid than a daughter-in-law. Each day, I cooked, cleaned, and cared for Joe, my father-in-law, who still hadn't regained his ability to speak. His eyes, full of gratitude and apology, often met mine, offering silent thanks that Linda never voiced. During one of my increasingly rare calls with Mark, I tried to explain how strained things had become. "Mark, it's tough here. Your mom, she's really hard on me. And your dad needs more care than I can manage on top of everything else," I confided, the weight of my exhaustion evident in my voice. "I know it's hard, Elle. Just hang in there a bit longer, okay? Dad will get better, and once he's up on his feet, you can come back home," Mark pleaded. Determined to do more for Joe, I completed a course in massage therapy tailored for stroke recovery. Each evening, after the dinner dishes were cleared and Linda had retired to her room with a grunt, I'd help Joe into a comfortable chair and gently work his stiff muscles. Things took a surprising turn when Linda announced she was feeling better and wanted to visit Mark. "I think I'll go stay with your husband for a few months, see the city," she declared one morning out of the blue. Her news should have filled me with dread at the thought of being alone, but instead, a wave of relief washed over me. When she left, the house felt lighter, as if her departure had lifted a heavy veil that had been smothering me. Finally alone, I established a new routine. Mornings were for Joe. We developed a silent camaraderie, communicating through gestures and shared smiles. I'd massage his limbs, encouraging movement, and his improvement, however slight, felt like victories in a war I'd thought we were losing. Afternoons and evenings were mine again. I reclaimed my time and dove back into my video editing with renewed vigor. Without Linda's constant nagging, I found my productivity soaring. I'd work late into the night, the glow of my laptop a beacon of normalcy in the otherwise turned upside-down world. Evenings were the hardest. I'd sit in the quiet after dinner, missing Mark, missing my old life, but also appreciating the peace. "I think we're doing okay, Joe," I'd say as we settled in after our dinner, speaking more to fill the silence than out of necessity. Joe would nod, his eyes crinkling in agreement or perhaps gratitude. Half a year had rolled around, and it was amazing to see how much Joe had improved. He was not only talking but had also started getting around with a new wheelchair I helped pick out for him. It was a game changer. He even began doing things for himself, like making his own snacks and managing his medication, which seriously lightened my load. During this time, Joe and I had grown incredibly close, so much that he started calling me his daughter, which warmed my heart every time he said it. It wasn't just about care anymore, it was about family, about the bond we had formed. One lazy afternoon, we were both in the living room, Joe in his wheelchair, flipping through channels, and me with my laptop, trying to catch up on emails. A thought had been nagging at me for a while, and seeing him so active and independent brought it to the forefront. "Joe, can I ask you something?" I began, hesitating a bit as I closed my laptop. "Of course, kiddo. What's on your mind?" Joe looked over, his face open and inviting. "Well, I was wondering, why didn't you ever consider going to a nursing home or maybe even short-term care at the hospital? It might have made your recovery easier," I said, genuinely curious. Joe looked genuinely surprised. "A nursing home?" I thought about it. Actually, I wouldn't have minded that at all. I'd even got some money saved up just in case I needed to go to a better place than what the basic insurance covers. I frowned, confused. "Really? Linda told me you were completely against it, that you wanted to stay here no matter what. She said there was no extra money for anything else." Joe's face hardened slightly. "That's not true, Elsie. I never said I wanted to stay here no matter what. And the money, it's there. I guess she didn't want me using it on a nursing home." That conversation left a sour taste in my mouth. It seemed there were decisions being made without Joe's input, which didn't sit right with me. But before I could dig deeper, my work pulled me back in. I'd landed a major video editing project that demanded almost all my attention. It was a big break for me, a chance to really make a name for myself in the industry. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Joe was doing well, my career was on an upswing, but there was a void where Mark used to be. His visits had become non-existent, and his calls were brief and distracted. Busy at work was always his excuse. As Joe's health stopped causing concern, I thought it was time to mend things at home too. With a heart full of hopeful anticipation, I packed up some of my things, hugged Joe goodbye, and headed back to the house that Mark and I had turned into a home. It was late evening when I arrived, the neighborhood cloaked in darkness, the familiar glow of our porch light a beacon in the night. But something was off. As I approached the front door, my key wouldn't fit into the lock. Confused and slightly anxious, I rang the doorbell. After a few tense moments, the door swung open, revealing a woman I'd never seen before. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing me suspiciously. I live here with my husband. Who are you?" My voice trembled, a mix of confusion and growing dread setting in. "I'm just watching the house for the new owner," she responded, her tone cautious yet firm. "New owner? There must be some mistake. This is my house," I said, the firmness in my voice belying the shock that was starting to take hold. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the house has been sold. Maybe you should call your husband or something," she suggested before she started to close the door. Panic rising, I stepped back, pulling out my phone to call Mark. My hand shook so badly, I nearly dropped it twice. When he finally answered, his voice was cold, detached. "Mark, what's going on? Why is there someone else in our house?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the strain. "Elsie, I sold the house. We needed to move on. I bought a new place with my mom. There's no room for you there," he said, his words like ice shards piercing through me. "But all the money I put into that house, our house. How could you sell it without even telling me?" I could barely keep the desperation out of my voice. Mark laughed, a sound so chilling it echoed in my ears. "You think you can prove any of that? Good luck, Elsie. Are you divorcing me?" My voice was a whisper, barely audible even to my own ears. "The papers are on their way to Dad's. You can sign them and send them back," Mark said flatly. "Mark, please, what about your dad? What about Joe?" I pressed, desperate for some semblance of sanity in this madness. "He's no longer my concern. Mom's got the will in her favor now. We don't need you, or him. Why don't you take care of him if you're so concerned?" His tone was dismissive, as if discarding not just his father but our entire life together. The line went dead, the finality of the tone signaling the end of everything we had built. I stood there in the dark, alone, the cold night air wrapping around me like a shroud. The woman in the house turned off the porch light, and suddenly the beacon that had always signified home was gone, leaving me in darkness. I stumbled back to my car, my mind a whirlwind of betrayal, pain, and disbelief. The drive back to Joe's was a blur, my thoughts racing as I tried to piece together the shattered remnants of my life. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Steeling myself, I got out of the car and walked up to the front door. It opened before I could knock, Joe looking up from his wheelchair, his expression worried. "Oh, Joe, it's all gone. The house, Mark, he's left us with nothing." Joe took a deep breath and looked me straight in the eye. "Elsie, I've known about their scheming for a while now," he began, his voice grave but steady. "After my stroke, when I couldn't speak or move, I heard them. Linda and Mark, plotting right in front of me." I stared at him, aghast. "What? You knew?" My voice cracked under the strain of my emotions. Joe nodded slowly. "Yes, I heard them planning to sell the house out from under you. And worse, they planned to dump me in some cheap care facility once they cashed in on my assets." I felt a cold fury building inside me, replacing the despair. How could they be so cruel? To you, to me? I struggled to wrap my head around the depth of their deceit. Joe's face hardened. "They're only after the money, Elsie. That's all they've ever cared about. He paused, taking a moment before he reached into the pocket of his cardigan. Pulling out a set of keys, he placed them in my hand. But I've made moves of my own. I bought the house back, secretly. It's yours now, Elsie. I want you to have it. Tears welled up in my eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief mixed with a fierce determination. Joe, thank you. I don't know what to say. The very next day, we met with Joe's lawyer, a seasoned man with a no-nonsense attitude named Mr. Gibson. In his office, filled with legal books and papers, Joe made it clear he wanted to change his will. I want everything to go to Elsie. She's the daughter I should have had, Joe declared, his voice unwavering. Mr. Gibson nodded, taking notes. I'll prepare the new documents. Elsie, you're about to become the sole heir to Joe's estate. Grateful, I simply nodded, overwhelmed by Joe's trust in me. We then tackled the issue of the money I'd invested in Mark's house. Mr. Gibson was methodical. We'll need to prove your contributions to the mortgage. Bank statements, any receipts you might have, witness statements from the bank officials. Fortunately, I'd kept meticulous records. I have everything. We can prove every penny I put in, I assured him, pulling out a folder stuffed with documents. That's good. We'll file for the recovery of your funds. They can't just take what you've rightfully invested, Mr. Gibson said, starting to outline a plan of action. With each step we planned, I felt more empowered, ready to reclaim what was mine and protect Joe from any more harm. When the divorce papers arrived later that week, I signed them without a second thought. I was ready to close that chapter of my life. A week later, Mark and Linda showed up at my doorstep, the house they once called theirs, now indisputably mine. Their faces were the picture of desperation. I had already heard through my lawyer that they were panicking over the lawsuit I planned to file, demanding back the $150,000 I had put into the mortgage. Elsie, please, we need to talk, Mark began, his voice shaky, avoiding eye contact as if the guilt was too much to bear. Linda chimed in, wringing her hands nervously. We're so sorry, Elsie. It all got out of hand. Please, can't we just put this behind us? I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not moved by their distress. Sorry? After everything you've done? You think a simple apology will fix it? But we're family, Linda tried again, her voice trembling. That ship sailed the moment you betrayed me and Joe, I replied sharply, the anger in my voice clear and unyielding. Seeing that their pleas were getting them nowhere, I decided to twist the knife a little deeper. And just so you know, Joe has changed his will. Everything goes to me now. The grin I wore was cruel, sweetened by the justice of it all. Linda's face went pale, and she fainted right there on my new porch. Mark, flustered and embarrassed, had to catch her before she hit the ground. The trial that followed was nothing short of a circus. Mark fought tooth and nail for every cent, refusing to admit that the money I invested was mine. Linda, ever the actress, put on quite a show in court, feigning illness to gain the judge's sympathy. But the evidence was undeniable. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. The defendant is ordered to repay $150,000 to the plaintiff. The evidence supports her claim unequivocally. Relief washed over me as justice was served. The gavel's final bang was like music to my ears. I walked out of that courtroom with my head held high, free from the chains Mark and Linda tried to place on me. Back at home, the house felt more like a sanctuary than ever. Joe and I celebrated quietly, a small toast to new beginnings and to justice. Life settled into a comfortable routine after that. I resumed my video editing work, finding joy in the craft that had always been my passion. Joe was more than just a father-in-law now, he was family, a true friend. News reached us through friends that Mark and Linda had to sell their flashy new apartment to cover the repayment. Now they were living in a rental, much humbler than before. It was a fitting turn of events, though I took no pleasure in their downfall. Just last week, Clara, my numerologist friend, called me up. Elsie, I found the perfect guy for you. His birth date lines up beautifully with yours. I couldn't help but laugh, a light, free sound that felt good on my lips. Thanks, Clara, but I think I'm going to stick to meeting people the old-fashioned way. Life's been too crazy for any more predictions. She laughed along with me, and we chatted for a few more minutes about life and love, the conversation light and easy. Hi, I'm Tessa. I've always been the kind to keep my head down and work hard. It's paid off. I landed a job at a major trading company right out of college and clawed my way up from there. Life was straightforward: work, sleep, and the occasional night out with friends to blow off steam. That routine changed the night I met Lucas. It was at one of those rare outings with friends, a loud party downtown where the music pounds in your chest and you have to shout to be heard. Lucas was different, more reserved, hanging back from the crowd, nursing a beer. He had that look, you know? Like he had a story to tell, but preferred to keep it to himself. We got to talking, or rather, shouting over the noise. Turns out, we both shared a distaste for these kinds of loud parties, which was kind of funny, considering where we were. Lucas was easy to talk to. He had this straightforward way about him that I appreciated right off the bat. Not really my scene, to be honest. He yelled over the music, a small smile playing on his lips. Then why are you here? I asked, genuinely curious. Trying to keep my cousin happy. She dragged me out tonight, he admitted, rolling his eyes slightly. Sounds like a good brother, I replied, nodding in approval. We ditched the party early, opting for a quieter bar down the street where we could actually hear each other. That night we talked about everything, from our jobs to our taste in movies. Lucas mentioned his previous marriage almost in passing. It didn't work out. She wasn't faithful, he said simply, his voice flat. But that's the past. His honesty caught me off guard, but it also made me respect him more. We started seeing each other regularly after that night. Things moved fast, and it wasn't long before we were talking about a future together. After Lucas and I decided to make things official, he was eager to introduce me to his mother, Susan. We planned a Sunday brunch at her place, and I remember feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. I wanted to make a good impression. As we pulled up to her tidy, two-story house, Lucas turned to me with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, it'll be fine. Just be yourself," he said, squeezing my hand. The moment we stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of bacon and eggs. The house was spotless, every item in its rightful place, which told me she probably spent the better part of the morning cleaning and preparing for this. "Lucas, my boy." Susan's voice rang out from the kitchen, followed by her appearance in the doorway. She wiped her hands on her apron as she approached us. Her gaze landed on me, and it felt like she was trying to x-ray my soul. "And you must be Tessa. Heard a lot about you." "Nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Thompson," I said, extending my hand. She shook it, her grip surprisingly firm. "Call me Susan." Mrs. Thompson was my mother-in-law, and I couldn't stand her. Her blunt statement threw me off, but I laughed it off. "All right, Susan it is." We sat down at the dining table, which was meticulously set with fine china and crystal glasses, an indication of how important this meeting was to her. Susan served us, then took the seat across from me, her eyes never straying far. "So, Tessa," she started, cutting straight to the chase. "Lucas tells me you're quite the career woman." "Trading, is it? Sounds like a man's world." I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a jab. "Yes, it's trading, and it's for anyone who's good at it," I replied, keeping my tone light. Lucas chimed in, perhaps sensing the tension. "Tessa's one of the top traders at her firm. She's really good at what she does." "That so?" Susan's voice carried a note of skepticism. "I hope you know, Lucas needs someone who's present, not stuck at the office all hours." I felt my cheeks warm up, but I kept my cool. I manage my time well. Lucas and I have plenty of quality time together. Susan hummed, poking at her food. "We'll see." I remember Lucas's ex was always busy too, until she was busy with someone else. Lucas's fork clattered against his plate. Mom, that's enough. Oh, relax. I'm just making conversation, Susan said, waving a dismissive hand. She then turned her attention back to me. Tell me, Tessa, do you cook? Or should my son expect takeout every night? I love to cook, I said, forcing a smile. Lucas can vouch for my lasagna. Lucas nodded vigorously. It's true. She makes a mean lasagna. Well, isn't that something? Susan's tone softened a fraction. Maybe you'll have to make it for me one of these days. The rest of the meal passed with small talk about the weather and Susan's garden, which she seemed more passionate about. Every now and then, she'd throw in a pointed question or comment, testing my responses. It was like a verbal sparring match, and I was determined not to let my guard down. As we were leaving, Susan pulled me aside. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but her words cut through the air. Listen, Tessa. My son's happiness is everything to me. I'll do whatever it takes to protect him. Remember that. I met her gaze, my voice steady. I have no intention of hurting Lucas. You have nothing to worry about. Susan studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll see, won't we? After the brunch with Susan, I thought maybe things would settle down, but I was way off. Lucas's work required him to travel a lot, which meant I was home alone often. Susan saw this as her chance to really crank up her watch over me. It started with unexpected visits. The first time it happened, I was working from my home office when I heard the doorbell. I opened the door to find Susan standing there, her face set in a stern expression that didn't promise anything good. Tessa, just in the neighborhood, she said, brushing past me into the house as if it was her own. Thought I'd drop by. I masked my annoyance with a tight smile. Nice to see you, Susan. What brings you here? Oh, just making sure everything's alright here while my son's away, she said, already wandering into the living room, eyeing everything critically. Her visits became more frequent, and each time, Susan had something to say about how I kept the house. It was like living under a microscope. One day, she walked into the kitchen while I was prepping dinner and started rifling through my pantry. Just seeing what you feed my son when he's home. You know processed foods are no good, right? She commented, holding up a box of pasta like it was evidence in a trial. But it didn't stop at home visits. I started noticing Susan around places I frequented, the grocery store, the gym, even the cafe near my work. It was getting creepy. One afternoon, I confronted her. She was, coincidentally, at the same grocery store as me, pushing her cart down the aisle I was in. Susan, this is the third time this week I've run into you like this. What's going on? She played innocent, a sly smile tugging at her lips. What, can't a woman do her shopping? Not at the exact same places and exact same times as her daughter-in-law, consistently. What are you trying to do, Susan? Her smile faded, and she leaned closer, her voice low and harsh. I'm keeping my eyes open, Tessa. You can play the perfect wife all you want, but I know about your desire to cheat on my son. Every encounter left me more frustrated and angry. It wasn't just the invasion of my privacy, it was the constant tension, the expectation of having to defend myself against imaginary accusations. Over time, Susan's eyesight had gotten worse, something about her age and her health stacking the odds against her. The doctor had given her glasses, but she hated them. Said they made her feel old and irritated her nose. She'd put them on and take them off, fussing and fuming, and more often than not, she'd just leave them somewhere and forget. Because of that, she saw very poorly, which only added fuel to her naturally suspicious nature. With Lucas away on another one of his frequent business trips, I had grown accustomed to handling things on my own, including dealing with Susan's relentless scrutiny. One evening, feeling a bit cooped up and in need of a change of scenery, I made plans to meet my brother, Jake, for dinner. It was a casual meet-up, nothing fancy, just a chance to catch up with family and unwind. I chose a little outdoor restaurant with a nice terrace that wasn't too far from where I worked. Jake arrived first, and I spotted him at a table, waving me over with a big grin. "Hey, sis," he called out as I approached. His face was all bright and cheerful, the typical big brother ready to tease or share a joke. "Hey, Jake. It's been too long," I said, giving him a quick hug before sitting down across from him. We ordered some food and drinks, and the conversation flowed easily, as it always did with Jake. We talked about work, family, and some of the latest movies we'd both seen. It was nice, relaxing, and exactly what I needed. As the evening wore on, we wrapped things up. Outside the restaurant, we stood up to say goodbye. I gave Jake a friendly hug, just a normal sister-brother moment. When I got home later that night, the house was dark and quiet. But as I turned on the light in the living room, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was Susan, sitting on my couch, a smug look plastered across her face, and holding what looked like a digital camera. "What the hell, Susan? What are you doing in my house at this hour?" My voice was a mix of anger and shock. She rose from the couch, holding up the camera. "Gotcha," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous triumph. "Got what, exactly?" I snapped, my patience thinning rapidly. "This." She thrust the camera in my face, showing a photo of Jake and me hugging. "Caught you red-handed with your lover." I rolled my eyes, tossing my keys on the table. "I was with my brother, Jake. We had dinner. That's it." Susan snorted, a harsh, mocking sound that made my hands clench into fists at my sides. "Sure, your brother. I know what I saw." "Oh, really? And what did you see with those failing eyes of yours?" I snapped back, my patience at its breaking point. Her face flushed with anger, and she fumbled with the camera, finally shoving it in my direction. "See for yourself." I took the camera, half expecting some blurry photo taken from a distance, but there it was, a clear shot of Jake and me, mid-hug, smiling. Just a brother and sister enjoying a nice evening out. I couldn't help but laugh, which only seemed to infuriate her more. "What's so funny?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Here, look." I handed the camera back to her. "Put on your glasses, Susan. It's just me and Jake." For a moment, she hesitated, then, muttering under her breath, she dug in her purse and pulled out her glasses. Slipping them on, she looked at the photo again. I watched her face change as she finally saw what was really there. "Now, I think it's time you left," I said firmly, my own resolve hardening. Susan looked like she wanted to argue more, but then she just nodded stiffly and headed for the door. "This isn't over," she muttered as she left. The few weeks Lucas was home felt like a dream. We were inseparable, catching up on lost time, and for a brief period, I could almost forget about the constant cloud of tension that was his mother, Susan. But like all good things, it came to an end too quickly. Soon enough, Lucas was packing his bags again for another extended business trip. I braced myself for the usual loneliness that accompanied his departures, but this time a new complication arose. Susan decided to move in. She showed up at our doorstep one afternoon, suitcase in tow, announcing her stay as if it were the most natural decision in the world. "It's for the good of the family, Tessa. I'm here to make sure you don't get into any trouble," she declared, pushing past me into the living room. I called Lucas immediately, my voice shaking with frustration. "She can't just move in here, Lucas. You need to talk to her." Lucas sighed on the other end of the line. "Tessa, please, just try to get along. I don't want to fight with her about this. It's only for a few weeks." Reluctantly, I agreed, but hanging up the phone, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't going to be easy. Susan wasted no time taking over the household. That first weekend, she followed me around, critiquing every little thing I did. "You're folding those towels all wrong," she'd say, or, "You missed a spot there, do it again." She even took over the kitchen, her worst idea yet. Due to her deteriorating eyesight, she constantly oversalted or overpeppered everything, but whenever the food turned out barely edible, she blamed me. "You must have distracted me," she'd snap, or, "You're trying to sabotage my cooking." During the weekdays, her behavior grew even more suffocating. She sat in the living room, a notebook in her lap, jotting down the times I left for work and came home. Any time I was delayed, even by traffic, she'd greet me with a sneer. Late again, Busy day or busy boyfriend? It was traffic, Susan. Like it is for millions of people every day, I'd retort, my patience fraying at the edges. Her insinuations were relentless, and each day ended with me locking myself in the bedroom, fuming but helpless. Lucas's request echoed in my mind, keeping me from unleashing the torrent of anger I felt. A month into Susan's invasive stay at our house, I finally got the news I'd been waiting for, a promotion at work. This wasn't just any promotion. It came with the opportunity for training at our company's main branch in another city. I'd been eyeing this chance for years, a real step up in my career. When I told Lucas over the phone, his excitement for me was palpable, even through the distance. "That's incredible, babe. I'm so proud of you," he enthused. "Don't worry about the time apart. It'll fly by, and we'll be back together before you know it." Despite the distance and the issues with his mother, his support was unwavering. It bolstered my spirits, filled me with warmth and determination. But then there was Susan. I broke the news to her one evening, trying to keep the conversation light and straightforward. "Susan, I've been promoted. I'll need to go to another city for a while to train," I explained, hoping to sound as nonchalant as possible. Her reaction was as expected, sour and accusatory. "So, you're running off to another city now? What's really there, Tessa? A lover?" she spat, her words dripping with venom. I sighed, frustration bubbling inside. "It's for training, Susan. There's no lover." "Why is that so hard for you to believe?" She snorted, her expression twisted in disbelief. "Sure, training. Just convenient timing, isn't it? As soon as Lucas is gone, you find a reason to leave too." I shook my head, unable to hide my irritation. "Believe what you want, Susan. I'm going, and that's final." With Lucas's blessing ringing in my ears, I packed my bags that night, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of my own home. Susan's persistent mistrust and conspiracy theories had drained me, and the idea of a few weeks away felt like a breath of fresh air. Once I settled into my temporary apartment in the new city, the sense of freedom was palpable. No Susan lurking around every corner, no insinuations or bitter comments at every turn. I was doing well in training, making new connections, and actually enjoying my evenings in peace. I found myself thinking, more than once, how pleasant life was without Susan watching my every move. But then, one ordinary afternoon as I returned from a session, my phone pinged with a new voice message from Susan. The content of that message turned my newfound peace upside down. "Tessa, I hope you're enjoying your time with your lovers, because you won't have a home to come back to. I've taken care of everything. The house is sold. Stay where you are, for all I care." Her voice, cold and triumphant, sent chills down my spine. I replayed the message, my mind racing. It couldn't be true. Lucas hadn't mentioned anything, and he owned the house, nothing could be done without his signature. Yet, the malicious glee in Susan's voice couldn't be ignored. What had she done? I called Lucas immediately, panic edging my voice, but the call went straight to voicemail. With him still on his business trip and likely in meetings or on a flight, I felt helpless, stuck in another city, the seeds of doubt Susan had planted now sprouting relentless anxiety. As the days passed with no return call from Lucas, my mind conjured up all sorts of disastrous scenarios. Had Susan forged his signature? Was it even legally possible to sell the house like that? The questions tormented me, gnawing at my focus and sleep. Despite the turmoil, I forced myself to continue with the training. I had worked too hard to let Susan's potentially empty threats derail my progress here. By the end of the training program, I was mentally exhausted, not just from the courses, but from the emotional roller coaster Susan had sent me on. I walked into the house, my mind still reeling from the chaos of the past few weeks. There, in the middle of the living room, stood Susan, squinting at me as if she couldn't quite make out who I was. She wasn't wearing her glasses again, which explained the unsure look on her face. But as I got closer, her expression shifted to one of smug triumph. "Welcome back, Tessa," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous cheerfulness. "I have some news for you." I dropped my bag by the door, bracing myself. "What now, Susan?" She thrust a stack of papers at me. "Here, read this. It's all settled. The house has been sold. You don't belong here anymore, or in this family for that matter." Her words were cold, calculated. Her claim was so outrageous that for a moment, I was too shocked to speak. "What are you talking about? Lucas would never agree to sell our house without discussing it with me first." "Oh, but he did. And he's tired, Tessa. Tired of your endless affairs," she added, a harsh edge to her voice. I snatched the papers from her hands, my heart pounding as I flipped through them. My eyes scanned the document quickly at first, then more carefully as something caught my attention. A laugh escaped my lips, not from amusement but from sheer disbelief. Susan looked at me, puzzled and clearly irritated. "What's so funny?" "Here," I said, pushing the papers back into her hands. "Put on your glasses and read it aloud. Read what you've signed." Reluctantly, she fumbled for her glasses, put them on, and started reading. "This agreement, made and entered into this day by and between." Her voice faltered as she continued, the realization dawning slowly. "This isn't a sale contract. It's a loan agreement for consulting services?" "Yes, Susan. That's right. You didn't sell the house. You signed up for a high-interest loan from some scam artists who took advantage of you." Susan's face went pale, her hands trembling as she held the document. "But I thought I was selling the house. There was an ad in the paper, and the man was so convincing. He said it could all be done without bothering Lucas with the details, that it was better this way." "You thought you'd sell my house out from under me? Without even a real check on what you were signing?" I was incredulous, anger and disbelief warring within me. Tears started streaming down her face, her earlier composure crumbling. "I just wanted to protect my son from you and your infidelities. I didn't mean for this to happen." I forgot my glasses, and everything seemed so legitimate. I stared at her, the weight of everything she'd put me through bearing down on me. "Susan, you have gone too far this time. You need to leave. Now." With a heavy heart but a clear resolve, I watched as Susan packed a few belongings into her bag, still sobbing, still muttering apologies. As she walked out the door, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. When Lucas returned from his business trip, I had a lot to tell him. As soon as he put down his bags, I started to unload everything that had happened, from Susan's attempted deception to the fake documents. He listened, his face growing tighter and more serious with every detail I shared. After I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, just staring at the ground. Then, he looked up, his jaw set. "This is unbelievable. It's time we taught Mom a serious lesson. What she planned to do was way out of line," he said, his voice firm and angry. However, the next day, after a tearful confrontation with Susan, where she pleaded ignorance and desperation, Lucas decided we needed legal advice. We consulted a lawyer to understand the full implications of what Susan had done. The lawyer was pretty clear. "From a legal standpoint, your mother-in-law voluntarily took out that loan and signed the contract. She's liable for the repayment," he explained in a no-nonsense tone. Susan's face when she heard that news was something I could never forget. She had thought she could manipulate her way out of the situation, but reality hit hard. She was on the hook for a significant amount of money, and there was no easy way out. She had to find a job, and fast. Within weeks, she started working 2 shifts, just to make ends meet. With Susan now occupied and no longer having time to meddle in our lives, Lucas and I finally found some peace. We decided it was a good time to take a break, to give ourselves a chance to heal and bond again after the chaos. We went to Hawaii for a second honeymoon, and it was blissful. We talked a lot about our future during those long, leisurely walks along the beach. "I think we're ready to think about having a baby, don't you?" Lucas said one evening, the sunset casting warm glows on his face. I smiled, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. Yes, I do. Let's enjoy being us for a bit longer, and then let's go for it. Sounds perfect, he replied, kissing me gently. Now, back from Hawaii, life feels lighter, simpler. We spend our weekends planning the garden, redecorating the house, just enjoying each other's company. Lucas supports me in everything, including my career and our future family plans. We've discussed timelines, how we're going to manage our work-life balance, and how excited we are to be parents. It's a new chapter for us, one that's filled with hope and looking forward.